Tonight we continue our series of interviews with candidates in the city election on November 7th. Our guest is running for City Council in District 7, which is being vacated by Tito Jackson. The district includes most of Roxbury and parts of Dorchester, the South End, and the Fenway. We'd like to welcome one of the two finalists, Kim Janey. Thank you very much for being with us, Kim.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
I want to go over some of your background with viewers if they didn't catch this before, because most of what you've been known for in recent years is your work in education. Talk about what you did at Mass Advocates for Children.
So there I lead the education policy work for Boston, advocating for the elimination of the opportunity and achievement gaps, particularly for children of color, children who are immigrants, children who are learning English, or children with disabilities, making sure that we're closing gaps for those children. And so there's a lot of work with parents and students and educators, as well as those who make policy.
How would you like to draw on that if you were to be the new city councilor?
Well, I think it's important to be able to work with a diverse group of individuals. I've been very fortunate to have built many relationships with different groups. I've worked closely with the Latino community, pushing for a new dual language school, and got that implemented in 2014, I believe it was. It opened up September 2014. Working with the Cape Verdean community, working with the Somali community, working with the Haitian community. So building those bridges, I think, is really important. Being able to work with diverse groups, whether around race and culture or whether around neighborhood. And then I think the policy expertise is also important. The City Council is the legislative body for making policy and laws pertaining to Boston, and so bringing that level of expertise, I think, is important.
The school system has a new funding challenge, because right now there's a push to put money where it works best in the schools that are most effective, but then you've got the other schools that are left behind and they lose some money. What do you do about that?
I mean, I think there are so many challenges when it comes to our schools. I think how schools are penalized around test scores is problematic and continues this cycle of who gets resources, who doesn't get resources, how we grade schools, how we blame students, how we blame teachers, how we blame parents for the failure, when this is really a systems failure. And so making sure that we have the supports, that we're supporting educators, that we're supporting our students, that we are providing adequate funding for our schools across the board, and making sure that there's equity. I mean, I think one critically important thing is equity. And so it's not always giving the prize to who's doing best, but how do we ensure that the supports are where they are needed for students who may be struggling, or for schools that may be struggling.
I want to ask you about some of the concerns around housing. The whole city is feeling this tightness of the housing market, but that's especially the case in Roxbury, and yet there's a lot of development, new development potential, and a lot of people in the community saying, we've got to do things differently to make sure Roxbury gets more benefit from that. How would you like to see that?
That's absolutely right. And so we, in the city of Boston, we have a housing crisis. Boston continues to be one of the most expensive cities to live in across the country, and my family, experienced gentrification firsthand. So my great-grandparents had a house in the South End. They bought that house in the 1920s for $2,000, which was a lot of money back then. And last year, one unit in this brownstone sold for $1.5 million. And while that might have been a nice way to pass on, generational wealth to future generations, we weren't able to hold on to that house. We lost it in the 1980s. The same thing that happened in the South End in terms of gentrification is happening right in Roxbury. We see it in other parts of the city, from South Boston to Chinatown. So it's a big challenge, and we need to make sure that the development that is happening benefits the people who live in the community now. We need a range of housing for the people who live here, from people who have lower incomes. We need to make sure that there's affordable housing that they can afford to live in. People who fall in the middle, who earn too much money to qualify for a subsidy or not enough to pay market rate or to buy a home, we need to make sure that we have housing for them as well. And right now, so much of the housing coming up is just unattainable for folks. We also need to make sure that there is opportunity for home ownership, so that we can stabilize our communities. And finally, we need to hold developers accountable for creating the right housing mix so that we're not pushed out and displaced from our community.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Kim Janey, candidate for City Council in District 7. Kim, another thing that's going on with these developments is the question of who gets the jobs putting up the buildings. The mayor recently made the standards more ambitious for giving those jobs to city residents, people of color, and women. But the spotty, compliance by all these developers and contractors, what do you do about that?
Right, so we definitely have to hold them accountable for the construction jobs. We need to make sure that they are, in fact, people who live in the city. And if it's in District 7, I would love for it to be people who actually live in District 7, live in the community, women, people of color across the board. We have to hold them accountable. If they're not living up to their end of the bargain, then there has to be some sort of consequence for that. But beyond the temporary construction jobs, which are so important, and we need to make sure that there is diversity and that those are people from our community in those jobs, if there's also an opportunity to have development where there's an economic engine, where there's going to be small business, maybe on the ground floor, commercial space, we need to make sure that there is an opportunity for business owners to get in, start a business, and do so in a way that they can really grow their business. So we've got to be creative about how we structure the lease for these buildings so that they can afford to grow their business and stay as well. So because those create permanent jobs.
Well, what about public safety? Crime is down overall, but there's an increase in gun violence in the city and still even more homicides than last year. What's the missing piece here that needs to be done?
Well, I don't think there's a silver bullet that's going to solve all of the challenges that we have in our community. But what I would suggest is that we need to do more in terms of partnerships with neighborhood associations, with police, building those relationships so that we can actually build trust. Right now, I think we try to do the partnership without the trust, and you can't do the trust if you don't have the relationship. I think the opportunity piece is missing, making sure that our young people have opportunities to earn real money, to take care of their families, to contribute to society. I think the education piece is also important, making sure that we are closing opportunity and achievement gaps so that children aren't dropping out of school and taking, a left turn instead of the right turn.
Well, one part of the trust equation is the use of body cameras by the police department. We've recently wrapped up a pilot program in that. The mayor says it should be studied a bit longer before anything permanent happens, but there are some other people saying, no, we should go right ahead with this.
I think we should go right ahead with this. So I was certainly advocating for the body camera, the pilot, but really beyond the pilot, how we do it across the board. I think it's important. I think it would go a long way in building trust with residents in the community.
Thank you. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Well, we should finally mention that you've got a website where people can get some more details about the
yes.
campaign and the issues.
Yes, so my website is www.kimjaney.org. Certainly invite your listeners, your viewers to go and look me up on my website. If they have any questions, they can reach me there as well. And I hope to earn the votes of people who live in District 7, which is Roxbury, South End, Dorchester, and Fenway.
Thank you very much for being with us.
On November 7th.
November 7th
November
is the election
7th
day.
is the election.
Kim Janey, candidate
you.
for City Council in District 7. We'll have more news in just a moment.